I always thought silence was supposed to be peaceful, a pause in the noise of life, a chance to breathe. But in my house, silence had become a heavy, suffocating thing. It wrapped around me like an unwelcome blanket, pressing in on my chest until I could barely catch a breath. My husband, Mark, had grown quieter over the years, not in the soft, companionable way old couples sometimes are, but in the secretive, withdrawn way of a man hiding something. At first, I convinced myself it was just age, work stress, maybe the aches of getting older, the strain of being married for more than 2 decades. We weren't newlyweds anymore. That warm, giddy glow had cooled into something steadier, or at least that's what I wanted to believe. But the truth is, I'd been noticing the cracks for a long time. Mark had a way of staying late at the office, even when I knew his company had slowed down. He claimed he had deadlines, but what kind of deadlines stretched until 2 in the morning? Sometimes he'd come home smelling faintly of aftershave when I hadn't seen him apply any in weeks. Other times he'd mutter an excuse about grabbing dinner with the guys, but couldn't name a single one when I asked. The signs were small, almost invisible if you weren't looking. But I was looking. A woman always knows when her life is shifting under her feet, even before she admits it. One Saturday afternoon, the quiet between us was broken when he dragged his laptop to the kitchen table. He placed it down with a groan, as though the thing itself had wronged him. "It's acting up again," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Freezes, crashes, you know. Can you take a look? You're better at these things." I almost laughed. Mark had always made fun of me for being too into tech. I wasn't some IT wizard, but I knew how to navigate a computer. He, on the other hand, treated technology like it was a wild animal he had to keep at arm's length. "Too old for apps," he'd once said, waving away a suggestion that he set up online banking. And yet, here he was, asking me to fix the very machine he barely tolerated. I pulled the laptop closer. The plastic was warm under my palms, and the screen flickered faintly before loading his desktop. 1,000 tiny icons stared back at me. Photos, folders, things he probably didn't even remember saving. I tried to focus on the mechanics, clearing temporary files, running a scan, updating software, ordinary steps, nothing dramatic. But the more I clicked, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't the sluggishness of the system that caught my attention. It was the hidden folders tucked away where most people wouldn't look. Folders with generic names like work docs or notes. I opened one, empty. Another, empty again. But my instincts were louder than the silence in that kitchen. Something told me to keep going. And then, there it was, a program I didn't recognize. Sleek icon tucked into the corner of his applications list. My stomach dropped. I clicked, and the truth bloomed in front of me like poison. A dating app, its logo glowing smugly on the screen. For a moment, I froze. My mind refused to process what my eyes were screaming. This wasn't just a glitch or some software bloat. This was intentional, downloaded, used. My hands trembled on the keyboard. I told myself maybe it was an accident. Maybe it came pre-installed. Maybe he'd clicked the wrong ad. But denial only lasts so long when the evidence is staring you down. Another app and another, each one confirming what the first had already told me. My husband had been looking elsewhere. The silence in the room thickened, humming in my ears. I could hear the refrigerator running, the faint tick of the clock on the wall, the sound of my own breath quickening. My marriage, our decades of shared life, suddenly felt like a fragile glass vase with a crack running straight down the middle. I didn't scream. I didn't call him in and demand an explanation. I just sat there, the glow of the laptop screen casting my face in pale light, thinking about all the years I had trusted him, all the excuses I had accepted without question, and all the nights I had waited for him to come home while he was... what? Swiping? Chatting? Lying? The anger didn't come all at once. It built slowly, rising up from a cold pit in my stomach until it reached my throat, hot and bitter. I closed the apps, cleared the screen, and set the laptop back on the table like nothing had happened. Mark walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, asking if I wanted coffee. He didn't notice my pale face, my stiff posture, the way my fingers dug into the chair. He just went about his business, humming tunelessly under his breath, while I sat there replaying what I had seen. That was the moment I decided. I wouldn't yell, I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing he had shaken me. No, I would play this game my way. And the silence that had been suffocating me, I was about to turn it into my sharpest weapon. I've heard people say that betrayal feels like being stabbed in the back. That's not true. Stabbing is sharp, quick, over before you know it. Betrayal is slower. It's like drowning in shallow water. Every instinct screaming at you to stand up, to breathe. Yet somehow you just don't. That's how I felt staring at those apps lined up like little neon confessions on my husband's laptop. The first one was bad enough, but when I saw the second, then the third, denial had no ground left to stand on. He hadn't accidentally downloaded anything. This wasn't curiosity or a one-time mistake. It was a pattern, a hidden life. I sat there, my hand frozen on the mouse, scrolling through profiles that weren't mine. He'd logged in, of course. His name wasn't visible, but I recognized the photos. Pictures he'd taken in our backyard, the grill in the background, the same shirt I'd bought him for Father's Day, cropped, filtered, and passed off as some bachelor act. There he was, smirking into the lens like a man unburdened by vows, by children, by me. The silence in the house pressed harder. I swear I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. Every part of me wanted to slam the laptop shut and march into the living room where he sat watching TV, pretending his world was spotless. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I leaned back in the chair, clutching the edge of the desk to steady myself. My thoughts spun out in a dozen directions. Why? Was I not enough? Was 20 years of loyalty worth so little? Had he ever loved me, or was I just the safe option? The woman who paid bills on time and remembered birthdays while he played out some secret fantasy online. I thought about the way he'd brush off intimacy lately, claiming he was too tired, too stressed. Meanwhile, he had the energy to swipe left and right, to send messages dripping with fake charm to strangers who didn't know the man who left socks on the floor, who forgot anniversaries, who sat across from me every night pretending we were still us. And then it hit me. Not just the betrayal, but the hypocrisy. He had always rolled his eyes at technology, claiming he was too old for apps, that it was all nonsense for kids. Yet here he was, navigating multiple platforms like some digital Casanova. My chest tightened, a mix of rage and humiliation twisting inside me. I opened one of the chat threads. Just one. His words were sickly sweet, like a cheap candy coating. "You deserve better," he wrote to a woman whose profile photo showed her pouting lips. "I'd treat you right." My vision blurred. That was the same line he'd once whispered to me years ago when he promised he wasn't like the other men I dated. Promises. Lies dressed up as vows. I closed the window before I could see more. I didn't want the details burned into my memory. Her name, her face, the full extent of his rehearsed charm. It was enough to know that while I'd been folding laundry, making dinners, keeping this family stitched together, he'd been out there weaving a separate life. My hands were trembling so badly I had to rest them in my lap. I thought of confronting him right then, shouting, throwing the laptop across the room. But another part of me whispered, "Don't." Not yet. If you explode now, it's your word against his. He'll twist it. He'll gaslight you. He'll make you believe you imagined it all. No, you need more than anger. You need control. So I did something I'd never done before. I took screenshots. Each app, each login, each faint trace of his activity. Evidence. Proof that my instincts weren't just paranoia. I saved them quietly, methodically, like a detective piecing together a crime scene. And all the while, he was still in the other room, laughing at some rerun calling out, "Hey, hun, what's taking so long?" As if my entire world hadn't just cracked down the middle. "I'm just running updates," I called back, my voice steady, though my insides were shaking. That night, lying in bed beside him, I could hardly sleep. He snored softly, oblivious, his hand draped across the blanket as though nothing was wrong. I stared at the ceiling, the glow from the streetlight spilling across our bedroom wall, and I knew something in me had shifted forever. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was a woman with a secret, a woman sitting on a truth so explosive it could tear everything apart. And in that silence, I felt the seed of something new take root. Not despair, not helplessness, but resolve. If he wanted to play games behind my back, then fine. I'd learn the rules. I'd play along. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but mine didn't start that way. At first it was molten, boiling inside me. I lay there in bed beside Mark, his steady snores filling the room, and imagined shaking him awake, shoving the laptop in his face and screaming until my throat gave out. I pictured myself packing a suitcase, slamming doors, leaving him to choke on his lies. The fury was raw, animalistic, begging for release, but rage has a way of exhausting itself if you give it time. By morning, that fire had cooled into something quieter, sharper, cold steel instead of burning coal. I knew what I had seen. I had the screenshots, the evidence. Yet if I confronted him too soon, I'd lose the one advantage I had, his ignorance. He thought I was still the trusting wife, oblivious and compliant. He didn't know I had glimpsed the world he thought he had hidden. That was my power. So I swallowed the fury, tucked it deep inside, and put on the mask I had worn for years, the mask of patience, of acceptance. Over coffee, I smiled and asked him how he slept. He stretched, yawned, muttered something about his back aching. Not once did he glance at me long enough to notice the storm behind my eyes. Inside, I was taking inventory. Not of his lies, that list was already long, but of myself, who I had become after years of giving, forgiving, overlooking. I realized I had been shrinking, bending myself into smaller and smaller shapes so his comfort could take up more space. I had lost the woman I once was, the one who had dreams, wit, and teeth when she needed them. But sitting there that morning, staring at the man who had traded loyalty for cheap dopamine hits, I felt her stir inside me again. She was tired of silence. She was ready to stand up. I started watching him differently. Every gesture, every offhand remark, every late-night business call, I began keeping a mental ledger of the discrepancies, the little cracks in his stories. Like the time he claimed to be exhausted from a client dinner but came home freshly shaved, a faint cologne clinging to his shirt that wasn't the one I had bought him. Or when he excused himself to the garage for a call, but his phone screen glowed just a little too long afterward, as though he'd lingered over more than business. He didn't know I was cataloging it all. He thought I was still that wife who nodded and smiled, who didn't ask questions because she trusted. But trust is fragile. Once shattered, the pieces cut deeper than glass. And then came the moment that crystallized my fury into resolve. One evening, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, his phone buzzed on the dresser. He was in the shower, humming tunelessly, blissfully unaware. I didn't even mean to look. My eyes just drifted over, catching the glow of a notification. A heart emoji followed by, "Can't wait to see you again, I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. That single glimpse was enough to confirm what the laptop had already told me. Enough to make the blood in my veins run cold. Enough to silence any lingering excuses I might have made for him. That night, I lay awake beside him again. Only this time, I didn't imagine leaving or screaming. I imagined something else, something darker, almost absurd. My eyes drifted to the small desk in the corner of the room where his laptop mouse rested. An idea flickered in my mind, outrageous and reckless. I almost laughed at myself for even thinking it. But the more I considered it, the more it made sense. He wanted to play games in secret? Then let's play. He wanted to sneak around like a teenager? Fine. I'd remind him what it feels like to be caught, to be powerless. The plan wasn't fully formed yet, but the seed was planted. I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't cry. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Instead, I'd become the architect of his downfall. Piece by piece, moment by moment, I'd build a trap so perfectly tailored to him that when it finally snapped shut, he'd never see it coming. I turned on my side, studying his face in the dim light. The man who once vowed to protect me, who had promised forever, lay there sleeping soundly, oblivious to the storm gathering beside him. His breath was slow, steady, peaceful. I whispered into the silence, so low he couldn't possibly hear, "Enjoy it while it lasts." Because I had made my decision. My fury was no longer the fire that burned me from the inside. It was the cold, calculating blade I would carry until the right moment. And when that moment came, I wouldn't just catch him in his lies. I'd make sure he never forgot who he had underestimated. I didn't plan theatrics because I wanted spectacle. I planned them because I wanted leverage, a single, undeniable moment that would unravel his lies without me having to raise my voice. That's how the idea of the mouse arrived. Ridiculous enough that it felt like a private joke, sharp enough to cut through his composure. I pictured him at his desk, the little cursor sliding, the world he'd curated on a screen, and then a twitch, a frantic scuttle, a man who couldn't just click unmatch and pretend it hadn't happened. It wasn't a plan born from cruelty. If anything, it was the opposite. I wanted a truth that would expose him and force consequences, but I also wanted to do it without burning everything down. Not yet. Years of marriage have a way of complicating simple acts of spite. There are shared bank accounts, a son who loves us both, a life built with flour and storefronts, and a dozen ordinary, unremarkable Tuesdays. So I forged a plan that felt surgical, precise, irreversible in impact, but limited in collateral damage. First, logistics. I wasn't about to improvise with whatever scurry I could find in the yard. I went to the pet store in town. Late evening, when the fluorescent lights made the aisles smell faintly of wood shavings and fluorescent cleaner. I walked past the tanks and cages, past the neon signs for parakeets and goldfish, and stopped at the small glass enclosure of mice. They were tiny and bright-eyed, their whiskers flicking like radio antennas. I watched one curl itself into a tortilla of fur and sleep. The idea felt darker and lighter at once. I picked the smallest, calmest one, a gray mouse with a white patch on its forehead, the kind that looked like it had been cuter on purpose. The clerk wrapped it in a small ventilated carrier with careful hands, smiling a practiced smile as if this kind of transaction was just another Tuesday for him. I paid, thanked him in a voice that kept its composure, and walked back to my car with the carrier on the passenger seat like a co-conspirator. I won't pretend I didn't worry. Using an animal was a line I had to consider. I told myself the mouse would be safe. I would be careful. I bought a tiny travel tube, a soft cloth, the smallest amount of bedding. When I placed the mouse in the tube that night, I talked to it. Not the big speeches movies give you, just plain words. "You're part of a plan to make a liar accountable," I said, half to the mouse and half to myself. The little creature twitched and then settled, as if it understood that my hands were not cruel. Preparation felt almost ritualistic. I watched where his mouse lived on the desk, to the right of the keyboard, slightly worn where his palm rested, a faint smudge of the captain's initials he'd carved into the plastic years ago. I tested the lid of the desktop so I could replace everything precisely. I unplugged the cable and thought through the sequence of sounds, the soft click as he lifted the mouse, the whisper of it brushing the desk, the microsecond before panic. I rehearsed in the quiet of the kitchen, moving slowly so nothing would creak. Timing mattered. No spectacle was worth an accidental confrontation in the hallway or a panicked dog barking a reveal. There was collateral to consider beyond the mouse itself. I had the screenshots saved, backed, up to an external drive and to my phone. I'd printed a few, simple black and white copies tucked into a folder labeled, for my own future self, evidence. I wrote dates, times, and the app names in neat handwriting. It felt weirdly mundane, like bookkeeping for a crime of the heart. I hid that folder in a place the house had always trusted, under the loose floorboard by the stove, a spot only I remembered because I'd once dropped a recipe book there. Night came, and with it that practiced calm I'd been cultivating for days. Mark sat on the couch watching a detective show, engrossed in someone else's staged betrayals while his own carefully staged life sat open on a screen. I made sure the house hummed with normal chores. The kettle clicking off, the dishwasher finishing, the low thrum of the refrigerator. Routine was my camouflage. When he went to bed, as he always did a little earlier than me, I moved like a shadow. I carried the carrier to his office, heart steady, hands precise. I opened the mouse's tube and with a gentleness that surprised me, let the small animal hop into the hollow of the desktop mouse's shell, where I'd carved a tiny compartment the afternoon before. I'd thought of everything. Breathable holes, a little cushion, no sharp edges. I closed it carefully, checked the seam twice, set the old mouse's placement exactly as it had been. The bump of the worn plastic, the faint coffee ring, the precise lean toward the keyboard. I walked away with the same casual stride I used at the grocery store, the same ordinary hum of a woman who had made dinner and paid a few bills and kept the house from tipping into chaos. In the living room, Mark turned up the volume as the detective on TV reached for a crucial clue. I let my fingers rest in my lap, and for the first time in days I smiled without forcing it. It was a small thing, a private machinery set in motion, but I already felt something shift inside me. A movement from victim to agent. The silence we'd been living under would no longer be a blanket. It would be a surgical instrument. I had seeded it with truth, and now I would wait to see what it harvested. The house was heavy with sleep when I made my move. Mark had gone to bed earlier, the kind of early that comes with a man too comfortable in his own routine, too confident no one is watching. His snores rolled through the walls like low thunder, and I sat in the dim light of the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea I wasn't drinking. My mind wasn't on rest, it was on precision. I crept into his office just past midnight, barefoot so the floorboards wouldn't betray me. The desk sat in its usual chaos, a stack of bills, a glass with rings of dried whiskey at the bottom, his laptop with the lid half closed. To anyone else, it was just clutter. To me, it was a stage. I set the small carrier on the desk, whispering almost without realizing, "We're both in this." Together, the gray mouse twitched its whiskers, nose pressing against the vent like it was curious about what came next. My heart pounded in my throat, but my hands stayed steady. I opened the compartment I'd carved into the base of the mouse shell earlier that day and slipped the tiny creature inside. It curled against the cloth I'd tucked in, a little heartbeat inside a plastic disguise. For a second, I just stared at it. Not with guilt, but with awe at how absurd and strangely poetic this all was. He'd thought he could control his double life with clicks and swipes, hiding betrayal behind a cursor. Now that same cursor would betray him. I closed the shell carefully, ran my fingers along the seam to make sure it looked untouched. I placed it back to the right of the keyboard, aligning it with the faint coffee stain that had been there for years. If there was one thing Mark loved, it was routine. His pen on the left, his mouse slightly tilted outward, his chair angled just so. I left it all undisturbed, down to the inch. I stepped back and looked at the scene as if I were a stranger. Nothing appeared out of place. The laptop screen was dark, the mouse a shadow beside it, the desk a monument to mediocrity. Perfect. As I walked back to our bedroom, my pulse finally slowed. Mark was sprawled across the bed, mouth open, blissfully unaware. He didn't stir when I slipped under the blanket. He didn't sense that the very air between us had shifted. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the morning. Him, bleary-eyed with coffee, plopping down to check emails, the flicker of irritation as the mouse didn't respond the way he expected. Then the scuttle, the twitch, the revelation. I pictured his face, the mix of confusion, panic, and shame. For once the secret would turn against him. The hours until dawn crawled by. Every sound felt amplified, the click of the furnace, the hum of the refrigerator, even the rustle of leaves outside. But beneath it all, I felt a rare calm. It was the calm of a woman no longer pacing in her own cage. When sunlight finally seeped through the blinds, I was already in the kitchen, pouring coffee, arranging breakfast like any other day. Mark came down in his robe, yawning, hair a mess. He kissed the top of my head absent-mindedly, muttering something about deadlines. I nodded, sliding a plate toward him. "Laptop's in your office. I updated a few things last night. Should be running smoother." The words came out easy, practiced. He didn't question them. He just grunted a thanks, carrying his mug down the hall, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. I sat at the table, heart beating a steady drum. I could almost hear the moment when he dropped into the chair, the scrape against the hardwood, the click of the laptop lid, the faint shuffle as he grabbed the mouse, and then a sound I had waited for, a sharp intake of breath, followed by a startled clatter, a muffled curse. My hands tightened around my mug, but I kept my face neutral, my posture calm. The trap had sprung. I stayed seated, letting the seconds stretch, letting him feel the weight of confusion, the absurdity of it. Because in that absurdity lay the first crack in the mask he'd worn so confidently. This was only the beginning. There are sounds in a house you learn to categorize instantly. The creak of the stairs that means someone's coming down, the slam of the fridge door, the hiss of the kettle. But that morning, the sound that cut through everything was foreign, jagged, the frantic scrape of a chair against the hardwood, followed by a high, startled yell that didn't belong to the man I'd been married to for 2 decades. I sipped my coffee like it was any ordinary Wednesday, though my pulse beat so loudly I thought he'd hear it from the other room. "Jesus Christ," he shouted. His voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since our son was born, when he'd fumbled with diapers and panic, muttering that he wasn't ready. But this was no diaper. This was a grown man meeting the thing he least expected, truth, dressed up in fur and whiskers. The clatter of the mouse hitting the desk was followed by silence. Not calm silence, but the tight, vibrating pause of disbelief. I pictured him staring, eyes wide, brain scrambling for logic. Was it broken? Was it moving? Did he imagine it? Then came the scuffle. The sound of the mouse skittering across the smooth wood, tiny claws tapping like typewriter keys. Mark shrieked, actually shrieked, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard it nearly bled to keep from laughing. I rose slowly, careful not to betray myself, and padded toward the office door. I lingered in the hallway, hidden, letting the scene play out. "Get out, get out, get out," he hissed, flailing papers into the air, knocking his coffee over, the hot liquid splattering across invoices and envelopes. His chair rolled back violently, colliding with the bookshelf. The mouse darted toward the corner, vanishing behind the curtain, and he froze, panting. One hand braced on the desk like the room itself was spinning. His face was pale, sweat already dotting his forehead. I stepped in then, feigning confusion. "What's going on?" He whipped his head toward me, wild-eyed, a man stripped of composure. "There's something in the mouse." It moved. It... I tilted my head, pretending not to understand. My gaze slid to the desk. Papers scattered, coffee dripping, laptop askew. The scene looked like chaos incarnate. "What do you mean, in the mouse?" I asked gently, letting the disbelief drip from my voice. He sputtered. It was alive, I swear. I grabbed it and it... He pointed toward the curtain, trembling like a child who'd seen a ghost. I let my brows furrow, soft and skeptical. "Honey, you probably need more sleep." "Maybe it just jammed. You've been working too hard." The anger that flashed in his eyes wasn't directed at me. It was the anger of a man realizing he couldn't control the narrative. He wanted me to join his panic, to validate what he'd seen. But I gave him only calm denial. That's when he snapped. "No! I'm telling you, the damn thing moved, like a real mouse." The irony almost knocked the air from my lungs. A real mouse inside the fake one, a metaphor so perfect I wanted to frame it, but I kept my voice level. "Maybe call IT, they'll sort it out." He froze, the words hanging between us. IT, outsiders, witnesses. The idea that someone else might poke around his laptop, his fortress of lies, made his throat bob like he'd swallowed glass. For a split second, I thought he'd refuse, that he'd double down, shove the whole mess into the trash, insist it was nothing. But his pride overrode his paranoia. He wanted someone to confirm he wasn't losing his mind. "I'll call them," he muttered, his voice uneven. I'll have them come over today." I nodded, the perfect picture of support. "Good idea." Then I turned, heading back to the kitchen, where the smell of burnt coffee and scorched paper still lingered faintly from his disaster. I sat at the table, folded my hands, and smiled into my cup. The mouse had done its job. The calm facade he'd built, the mask he wore so well, was cracked wide open. And soon, with IT poking around where he least wanted them to, the rest of his secrets would come crawling out. By the time the IT guy pulled into the driveway, Mark had worked himself into a lather. He'd spent the morning pacing the length of the house, muttering under his breath, half-heartedly mopping the spilled coffee from the office carpet. Every time I passed by the doorway, he snapped his laptop shut like a teenager caught with contraband. He thought his frantic movements were discreet, but they were as obvious as storm clouds rolling in over the plains. He'd convinced himself the morning's chaos was mechanical. A glitch, he called it. A mouse that shorted out. He even muttered once, as if trying the excuse on for size, "These companies cut corners. Cheap hardware. That's all." His voice cracked halfway through the lie. I didn't contradict him. I just moved quietly through the kitchen, letting my silence press against him like a mirror he couldn't look away from. My calmness unnerved him more than any accusation would have. When the knock came at the door, Mark practically leapt. His hands were sweaty when he opened it, and there stood a young IT tech in a company polo, laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He was the kind of guy who probably fixed printers all day for people who swore technology hated them. He had no idea he was about to stumble into something far stranger than a jammed ink cartridge. "Morning, sir. You said your computer peripherals weren't working?" Mark nodded too quickly. Yeah, the mouse. It malfunctioned. Just take a look." I hovered in the doorway of the kitchen, wiping my hands on a dish towel, playing the role of the polite wife who was merely curious. But inside, my pulse thrummed. I'd been waiting for this moment, a stranger's eyes on Mark's carefully curated secret life. The IT guy settled into the office chair, rolling up to the desk. He clicked the mouse once, twice. Then he frowned, wiggling it. The mouse didn't respond. He flipped it over, tapped the underside. The tiniest squeak leaked from the seam, so faint I almost doubted I'd heard it. The man's eyes widened. He dropped the mouse like it had burned him. "What the—" Mark lunged forward, trying to laugh it off. It's just jammed. Old equipment. Nothing." But the mouse twitched, a gray nose poking out from the crack where plastic met plastic. The IT guy jerked back, chair wheels squealing against the floor. "Sir," he stammered, "there's a live animal in here." The room froze. Mark's face went slack, then crimson. "That's impossible," he barked, but his voice betrayed him, a thread of panic unraveling. The IT guy stood, shaking his head. "I've seen fried circuits, malware infestations, even coffee spills. But I've never seen a rodent crawling out of a mouse." He gave a nervous laugh, then clutched the desk for balance, his cheeks drained of color. For a moment, I thought he was joking. Then his knees buckled. Mark shouted, lunging forward, but it was too late. The IT guy fainted right there, crumpling onto the carpet beside the scattered invoices. His body hit with a dull thud, glasses slipping crooked on his face. I pressed the dish towel to my mouth to hide the smile that threatened to break through. Mark crouched, slapping the man's cheek lightly. Hey, wake up! His voice was frantic, half angry, half afraid. The mouse chose that moment to wriggle free, scampering across the desk before darting behind the bookshelf. Mark recoiled, shouting another curse. The IT guy stirred, groaned, and blinked awake. What happened? You fainted, I said softly, stepping into the doorway now, my expression the perfect mix of concern and composure. You must have been startled. He sat up slowly, looking from me to Mark, then to the desk. His eyes landed on the mouse darting back into view, and his face twisted in disbelief. Sir, this is not normal. You need to explain. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. His jaw worked like he was chewing glass. I tilted my head, voice calm, almost soothing. Maybe you should check the laptop too. Make sure nothing else unusual is going on. The IT guy nodded shakily, climbing back into the chair. His fingers flew across the keyboard, and within minutes his brows furrowed deeper. Sir, there are multiple third-party applications installed here. Dating platforms, messaging clients. This system is cluttered with them. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face drained, then flushed hot again. He sputtered, That's spam. Malware. I didn't install anything, but his lie landed flat, hollow. Because in that office, with a living mouse scurrying behind the curtains and his double life glowing on the screen, there was no hiding anymore. And for the first time in years, I felt no need to raise my voice. The cover-up was crumbling all on its own. I'd seen plenty of moments in my life where Mark talked his way out of things. He was slick when he wanted to be. Could charm a cop out of a ticket, could smooth over missed deadlines with a grin, could look me in the eyes and convince me his lateness was just traffic, not lipstick on his collar. But this morning was different. Watching him squirm under the gaze of a young IT tech who still looked pale from fainting was like watching a magician fumble his own deck of cards. The IT guy rubbed his temples, muttering, I don't even know how to write this up. A live mouse in a mouse, and all these dating apps clogging the system. His tone was dazed, like he was speaking more to himself than to us. Mark barked back too quickly, too loudly. Those apps aren't mine, it's spam, that's what it is, junk software. He crossed his arms, but his hands shook. I leaned against the door frame, arms folded, my face calm. If I'd raised my voice, it would have been a fight. But silence, paired with the faintest quirk of a smile, was its own weapon. I could feel his panic growing with every second I didn't defend him. The IT guy turned the laptop so the screen faced us both. Tabs open, profile pictures, messages, all in plain sight. The cursor hovered over one app, showing a list of unread notifications. My husband's face, cropped, filtered, half-smile, stared back at me from one of the profiles. The IT guy glanced between us. His face said it all. You're married. Why is your husband catfishing women from his home computer? Mark slammed the laptop shut, nearly catching the tech's fingers. That's enough. You've done your job. Get out. But the man didn't move. He stood slowly, shaky but stubborn, eyes still locked on Mark. Sir, with respect, I'm obligated to report breaches like this. If your system is being used for personal activity, it's a security risk. Mark's voice cracked, desperate now. There's nothing to report. It's my laptop, my business. You don't? The mouse in the corner chose that exact moment to dart back across the carpet, heading for the shadow under the couch. The IT guy yelped and stumbled backward into the bookshelf, sending a pile of old manuals tumbling onto the floor. His face drained white again, knees buckling. "Not again," he whispered hoarsely. His eyes rolled back and he collapsed for a second time, this time sprawled against the carpet in a heap of wires and papers. Mark stood frozen, torn between chasing the mouse, shaking the IT guy awake, or explaining away the dating profiles that were now burned into both our memories. He muttered a string of curses under his breath, hands clawing at his hair. I stepped forward calmly, crouching by the unconscious technician. His pulse was steady, his breathing even. Just shock. I brushed the hair from my face and looked up at Mark, letting the weight of the moment settle. "You should call his office," I said quietly. "Tell them he fainted." Twice Mark glared at me, his mouth half open, words trembling behind clenched teeth. But he didn't say anything, because what could he say? That the live mouse wasn't his fault? That the dating apps weren't his either? That both disasters had simply appeared? Even for a man like him, that lie was too thin to stand on. The house was thick with silence again, but this time it wasn't mine to bear. It was his shame, his lies, his crumbling cover story. I stood, smoothing my skirt. "I'll wait in the kitchen," I told him softly, like a nurse giving instructions. "Handle it however you want." As I walked away, my steps were slow, measured. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of him kicking the desk, muttering to himself, the panic now eating him alive. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the one being fooled. The IT guy eventually stumbled out of our house, pale and shaky, clutching his laptop bag like a lifeline. Mark walked him to the door with all the stiffness of a man escorting his own executioner. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a coffee mug I didn't need to rinse, listening to the quiet murmur of their goodbyes. The door shut, and for the first time since sunrise, the house was silent again. But it wasn't my silence anymore. It was his. Mark stormed back into the office like a man on fire. I lingered in the hallway long enough to hear the furious clicks of his keyboard, the hiss of crumpled paper as he stuffed things into the shredder. He was moving too fast, panicked, like a thief erasing his tracks. The laptop fan roared, a digital gasp as he wiped histories, uninstalled apps, scoured his digital life of the stains he thought I hadn't already seen. I sat down at the kitchen table, folded my hands, and waited. That's all I had to do. Wait. Every so often he'd emerge, sweaty, pacing, mumbling excuses that weren't meant for me, but spilled out anyway. It's spam, malware, junk software. Anyone could have logged in. People hack these things all the time. His words were like scraps thrown into the void, desperate to catch on something solid. I never answered. I just nodded occasionally, humming faintly as I folded a dish towel or wiped crumbs from the counter. My calmness was gasoline on his fire. By mid-afternoon, he was muttering about buying a new laptop. "I'll just replace it," he snapped when I walked past the office door. "Start fresh." "This one's corrupted." I paused in the doorway, tilting my head as if considering. Replacing the hardware won't erase the habits. My voice was soft, almost kind, but it landed like a stone. His face flushed, deep crimson. He turned back to the screen without replying. While he panicked, I documented. Every time I passed through the office, I took mental snapshots, the shredder bin filling with scraps, the pile of deleted app folders in the trash, the faint trace of browser history before it vanished. On my phone, I opened my photo album and looked at the screenshots I'd taken days earlier. The evidence was safe, backed up, printed, hidden under the floorboard. His erasing was for nothing. As evening approached, he tried a new strategy. He sat across from me at the dinner table, fork clinking against his plate. "You know," he began, voice artificially casual, "sometimes computers make things look worse than they are. Algorithms auto-downloads. It's all designed to trick people." I met his gaze over my glass of water. "Funny," I said. "I've never had a dating app auto-download itself onto my laptop." He choked slightly, his fork clattering against the plate. I didn't press. I just kept eating, each bite measured, deliberate. After dinner, he retreated again into the office, shutting the door this time. I heard drawers slam, the faint rip of envelopes being torn, the click of his lighter as he burned something in the metal wastebasket. The smell of scorched paper drifted down the hall, acrid and sharp. He thought he was burying the truth, but all he was doing was proving how afraid he was of it. I wrote in my own notebook that night, sitting at the kitchen table under the soft yellow light. Dates, times, what I saw, what he did. The notebook wasn't just a record, it was armor. A reminder that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined any of it. By midnight, the house was still again. He finally collapsed into bed, sweat beading on his forehead, muttering in his sleep. I watched him from my side of the bed, pen still in my hand, and wondered if he knew he was unraveling. Because here's the thing about secrets. They don't just disappear. They haunt. They scratch at the door until someone hears, and his were scratching louder every day. I slipped the notebook under my pillow, turned off the light, and closed my eyes. Tomorrow would bring more lies, more erasing, more scrambling. But I had patience. I had silence. And I had proof. Mark had no idea that while he was trying to cover his tracks, I was already miles ahead, building the map that would lead him straight into his own trap. The morning after his frantic purge, the house felt wrong. He sat at the table in his work shirt, sipping coffee too quickly, his hand jittering against the ceramic, like he was trying to swallow his nerves along with the caffeine. I didn't ask where he was going. I didn't have to. He was off to damage control. The IT department had called early, their technician's fainting episode now, circulating as office gossip. "Strangest call of my career," I overheard him mumbling into the phone in the hallway, voice tight. I could practically see the story spreading, turning from a glitch into a spectacle. He slammed the receiver down when he caught me watching, but his ears burned red. By noon, he was back, his face pale, his shirt damp under the arms. He dropped his briefcase on the floor like it weighed 50 pounds and wouldn't meet my eyes. They're doing a deeper scan," he said flatly, reaching for another cup of coffee. His hands shook as he poured. "Protocol, standard stuff." I tilted my head. "Standard? For a mouse infestation in your mouse?" He shot me a glare, but I didn't flinch. What he didn't say was that his laptop hadn't stayed in his hands. The company had taken it. For security checks, they would comb through his files, his apps, his browser history. Everything he thought he could shred or burn at home was still there, preserved in the machine he thought was his secret vault. By late afternoon, the phone rang again. This time I answered. A polite voice introduced himself as the IT supervisor. "We're contacting you because the laptop in question was registered under the household account. Are you aware of any non-work programs your husband may have installed?" I let my silence hang just long enough before saying, "I've seen a few." Mark practically leapt across the kitchen, grabbing the phone from my hand, his voice rising. "That's enough. My wife doesn't know what she's talking about. It's malware, I told you." The supervisor's voice was calm, professional. "Mr. Harris, these programs require manual logins. They're not malware. We're flagging the device for further investigation." Mark's hand clenched so tightly around the receiver that his knuckles turned white. He hung up abruptly, then spun on me, his chest heaving. "Why didn't you just stay out of it?" I stayed seated at the table, folding a napkin neatly. "Because it's my house, too. My name's on that account. If your mess spills into my life, I have every right to know." His jaw worked like he wanted to spit venom, but he stopped short. He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time I saw something new in his eyes. Not arrogance, not dismissal. Fear. That evening, the fallout began. He got a call from a colleague, his voice muffled but loud enough for me to catch the words, "dating apps in breach." His explanations came fast and brittle. "It's not what it looks like. No, that wasn't me. Someone hacked it, I swear." He hung up, sagging against the wall like the house itself had turned against him. His shoulders hunched, his tie half loosened, his face gray with exhaustion. But exhaustion didn't absolve him. It only made his guilt more visible. Meanwhile, I pulled out my own insurance, the folder under the floorboard, the screenshots on my phone, the notebook under my pillow. I didn't wave them in his face. Not yet. Their power came from waiting, from letting him bury himself while I held the shovel. When the phone rang again, he didn't answer. He just sat at the table, staring at his hands. The silence stretched. Finally, he muttered, "They think I compromised client data. They're calling it a trust issue." I leaned forward, my voice low. "Funny. That's what I'd call it too." His head jerked up, his mouth open as if to defend himself, but no words came. He just sat there, caught between anger and dread, both of which looked suspiciously like defeat. I cleared the dishes, humming softly to myself, letting the moment settle like dust after a storm. His cover story had collapsed, not because I screamed, not because I confronted him directly, but because the world he depended on to shield him had turned into his accuser. And I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The thing about secrets is that once they leak, they spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, Mark's malfunctioning mouse and malware full of dating apps had become the story of the office. I knew because I overheard him on the phone, hissing into the receiver in our bedroom late at night. "No, it wasn't me. They've got it wrong. Don't repeat that. Damn it, Jeff. I said drop it." His voice wasn't the confident baritone he used when closing deals. It was ragged, cracking around the edges. He slammed the phone down so hard the picture frame on the dresser rattled. By morning, whispers had followed him home. Our neighbor, Mrs. Collins, caught me outside with the recycling bin. Her lips pursed with faux concern as she asked, "Everything all right with Mark?" My cousin works at the firm. She said there was some unusual trouble with his computer. Her eyes glinted like she already knew. I gave her the sweetest smile I could muster. "Oh, you know Mark." Always getting into trouble with technology, I let the pause linger, just long enough for her imagination to finish the sentence I wouldn't. By the time I came back inside, Mark was pacing the kitchen, tie already loosened, though it wasn't even 9 a.m. "They're making jokes now," he snapped, slamming a mug onto the counter. "Squeaks and clicks, that's what they're calling me." Can you believe that? Squeaks and clicks. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. The irony was too sharp. He'd built an entire double life on clicks, and now it had squeaked its way into the open. At work, his colleagues weren't the only ones talking. By Friday evening, the whispers had reached the bar down the street where he sometimes lingered after hours. I knew because one of the bartenders, a woman I'd befriended years ago, texted me, "Your husband's the talk of the night, mouse man. Dating apps on company time. You okay?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back a simple, "I'm fine." More than fine, Mark wasn't fine. Every night he came home later, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes darting, muttering about fixing the narrative. But the narrative was no longer his to fix. The IT report had made its way to management. They couldn't prove he'd compromised data, but the stink of scandal was enough. He was suspended pending review. The day they told him, he sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered the glowing apps, the messages, the lies stacked like bricks between us. Pity was a luxury he hadn't earned. "I've worked 20 years for that company," he muttered, voice hollow. Gone. Just like that. Over nothing, I set a plate of food in front of him, meatloaf and green beans. Simple. Grounding. "It wasn't nothing, Mark. It never was." He lifted his head, eyes bloodshot, and for the first time I think he realized I knew. Not just about the apps, not just about the IT fiasco, but everything. The mask slipped. He opened his mouth, maybe to confess, maybe to spin another lie, but no sound came. And I didn't press. Because I didn't need his words anymore. The world had already spoken for him. His humiliation was public property now, shared in whispers and snickers, cemented in the nickname that would cling to him long after the office forgot the details. Mouse Man. I cleared the table quietly, letting him stew in the silence he used to wield against me. Funny thing about silence. It changes hands quickly when the truth gets loud enough. Later that night, as he sat in the dark living room with the TV flickering against his gaunt face, I stood in the hallway watching. He wasn't the man who once strutted through our door with the world at his feet. He was a man cornered, stripped of control, gnawed at by the very secrets he thought he could keep buried. And for the first time in years, I felt taller, stronger. Not because I had shouted him down, but because I had let the truth do the work for me. His reckoning wasn't just personal anymore. It was public, and there was no covering that up. The collapse wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly like a balloon losing air, a slow hiss that left Mark smaller and smaller each day. He stopped shaving. His work shirts hung off him like costumes from a play he'd been kicked out of. The man who once filled a room with his presence now sat hunched in the recliner, scrolling endlessly through news sites as if distraction might erase the whispers outside our walls. I, on the other hand, felt lighter. For years I'd carried the weight of suspicion, of silence, of waiting for the other shoe to drop. But now the shoe had dropped, loudly and publicly, and I wasn't the one crushed beneath it. He was, and for the first time I could breathe. I poured myself coffee in the mornings without rushing to set his cup beside it. I baked pies again, not because he liked them, but because I did. I walked to the park on Saturdays, stopping to chat with neighbors who looked at me with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not judgment, but respect. They knew I had endured humiliation without collapsing, that I had turned silence into strategy, pain into patience. Mark tried now and then to claw his way back. He'd start to speak at dinner, eyes darting, voice low. Listen, about the computer, about those apps. But I'd lift my hand gently, palm out. Don't, I'd say. And he'd shut his mouth, the words dissolving in his throat. He knew he no longer controlled the story. I did. It wasn't revenge that filled me, not anymore. It was liberation. Liberation from the doubt that had gnawed at me for years. Liberation from the suffocating silence I'd mistaken for peace. Liberation from the woman I'd been, the one who folded herself smaller to make space for his ego, his excuses, his lies. I kept my evidence safe, not because I still needed it, but because it reminded me of who I'd become. A woman who didn't crumble when the truth tried to bury her. A woman who chose her moment and watched him unravel in front of everyone, not with screaming or chaos, but with calm certainty. On Sunday evenings, I'd sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea, listening to the crickets. Mark rarely joined me anymore. He stayed inside, curtains drawn, ashamed to face the neighbors. I let him. His shame wasn't mine to carry, and when I thought about the future, I didn't think about him. I thought about me, about the bakery I might finally open, the trips I might take, the recipes I'd been too tired to try. My life wasn't over just because he'd chosen betrayal. In fact, for the first time in years, it felt like mine again. I want you to hear this part clearly, because it matters. Betrayal doesn't define you. It doesn't shrink you. It exposes the liar, not the loyal. And once the lies are dragged into the light, you get to decide who you are without them. I chose strength. I chose silence that cut sharper than words. I chose myself. So if you're listening now, wherever you are, if you've ever felt the sting of suspicion, the weight of silence, the crack of betrayal, you're not alone. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find your own way to slip the truth out from under the rug and let it stand on its own. Because trust me, when you finally do, the air gets lighter, your voice gets steadier. And the person who thought they had all the control, they're the one left trembling while you step into the light. Did you like my story? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far my little tale has traveled. And if you enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe, because I've got plenty more stories to share. Stories about strength, about survival, about the quiet ways we take our power back. This has been mine. Now I'd love to hear yours. Life after. A storm doesn't return to what it was before. It settles into something different, quieter maybe, but edged with clarity. That's how it was for me once the dust around Mark's humiliation finally drifted down. The neighborhood didn't stop talking. They never do. At the grocery store, I'd catch the cashier glancing at me, then whispering to the bag boy as soon as I turned my back. At church, Mrs. Collins tilted her head with exaggerated sympathy, her voice dripping with curiosity. "How are you holding up, dear?" I smiled politely, nodded, and carried on. Let them talk. Their gossip wasn't a weapon anymore. It was background noise. Mark tried to rebuild. He applied for work at smaller firms, but the nickname followed him like a shadow. Mouse Man. I heard it once, muttered by two men on the sidewalk when he passed by. He hunched his shoulders and kept walking. His pride was a ragged thing by then, torn and stained. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a thick envelope in front of me. Inside were the screenshots, the notes, the printed logs, my meticulous archive of betrayal. On top lay a single sheet of paper, divorce papers, already signed on my end. Mark shuffled in, looking 10 years older than the man who'd strutted around weeks ago. His eyes landed on the envelope. He froze. "What's that?" he asked, voice rough. I pushed it toward him gently. The truth. In writing, he opened the envelope with trembling hands. His face drained as he flipped through the evidence. The screenshots, the apps, the notes written in my steady hand. Then he stopped at the final page, the divorce petition. His mouth opened, but no words came. For once, silence was his, not mine. "You made choices," I said quietly, and so did I. The room stayed still. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. He stared at the papers. A man who finally understood the ground beneath him had given way. I stood, sliding my chair back. "I'll give you space to decide how you want to end this, with dignity or with more excuses. Either way, I'm done living under the weight of your secrets." That night, I packed a small bag, just the essentials. Clothes, a book I loved, my notebook. I didn't slam doors. I didn't cry. I simply walked out into the cool night air. The sky above stretched wide and endless. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet wasn't suffocating anymore. It was freedom. So here's the last word. If you ever find yourself staring at betrayal on a screen, feeling like the air's been knocked out of you, remember this. You don't have to scream to be heard. Sometimes silence paired with patience is the sharpest blade you'll ever hold. I chose silence. I chose strength. And I chose me. And I'll never regret it.